It's quite an honor to be part of this webinar. I think my colleague, a very esteemed colleague, Professor Sfiso Ndlovu, might be online. We were invited to participate in this webinar because it's a webinar that is structured around a very important and a topic which is very close to our hearts. So Professor Sfiso and we published work in 2024 about ANC students who studied in Russia between the period of 1960s up until the late 1980s. And the reason why we did this work, it was based on the fact that I was very curious to understand exactly what a post-apartheid state formation meant in the present tense. And I needed to connect back to the liberation history struggle that some of the most important and significant individuals who studied, particularly in the Soviet Union, understood what a liberation for education meant for them. So Professor Sfiso supported me greatly in that journey so that I could connect the historical and the present tense through the quagmire that we face in South Africa, where state institutional capacity within the bureaucracy remains a challenge. So hence, I was so happy to hear that the keynote speaker referenced to that work, because a lot of work, colleagues, that capture the liberation struggle, as what the keynote speaker also addressed, that the liberation struggle started a long time ago, the fight for independence amongst African states, and Ghana was the first country to get its independence, followed by many other African countries. And then South Africa became the late bloomer in 1994. I just needed to find the connection and the historical symbolism in terms of understanding what it meant. So it was not just only a liberation struggle that was forged through the military armed struggle, but there was an education component to it. The main question that I had to interrogate was, when liberation movements finally attained their freedom, how do they then rebuild their post-colonial state? Do they rupture the state? Do they continue with the state formation that they had inherited through their former colonial masters? Do they create a different future for themselves? And was that future aligned with some of the political ideologies that they had learned from countries such as the Soviet Union? Because the Soviet Union played a very important role in educating students who were coming from liberation movements. Some of the students were stateless, like the South African ANC students and SACP students. Some of those students were already coming from a post-liberation state, such as Ghana. Other students came from Ethiopia, the EPDRF students and the Tigray students who went to study in the Soviet Union from Ethiopia. Others came from MPLA in Angola. Others came from Frelimo party that is in Mozambique. So what did it really mean? So I needed to make, certain references within their oral testimonies so that I could understand exactly that journey that they underwent, what they learned, and how they applied it post the liberation of their countries. So in this instant, what I can tell you is that from the research that I did, supported by Professor Sfiso Ndlovu, was that I understood that Russia played a very significant role. Russia, in terms of the former Soviet Union. And remember, the former Soviet Union had close to about 14 Soviet states. Others went to study in Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan mainly had an industry, which was the oil and gas industry. And those students who came from Azerbaijan, they became specialists in oil and gas. Hence, you find that Nosizwe Nokwe, who graduated in Azerbaijan, became one of the leaders in the petroleum industry when South Africa needed to reform the petroleum and gas industry in South Africa post 1994. Others came back as medical doctors, engineers, Some of them also participated in understanding exactly how Russia managed to rebuild in its country post the Second World War, because it was a country that was affected by the Second World War. But without getting into any ideological references, the most important aspect that I found to be very significant from students who studied in the Soviet Union was that they understood the socialist ideals of bringing equity and access to what we call in South Africa basic services: access to water, access to housing, access to infrastructure, access to roads. It was about the ability to connect the Black struggle of those who were oppressed during apartheid, who were alienated and marginalized, who didn't even have any form of a good quality education and access to healthcare system. When they were exposed to such socialist ideals, and I'm calling them ideals because the Soviet Union was not a communist country, it never realized communism, and we can debate that as much as we can. And Professor Ndlovu has produced quite impeccable work that shows that it was striving towards communism, but it was never reached. But socialism bred the ideals of access to basic human rights, access to basic facilities and services. So those students came back with those ideals. And hence, I found that some of the students who had returned to South Africa strived to ensure that within the institutions that they served post-apartheid, they drove that kind of conviction of bringing development to their own marginalized Black communities. So that was one of the inferences which I found to be very significant, because it's not just only about coming to a country where obviously the socio-political embeddedness of the South African system was within the capitalist ideals and understandings of how to produce a state. But they continued to use their learnings to push against the marginalization of oppressed South Africans. And I remember having an interview with Uhuru Mafeteng. Her mother was a very well-known unionist who has been documented very well in South Africa, who said to me that, Tina, I joined the city of Johannesburg, and I found that it was very apprehensive and hostile towards equity. So when she joined the city as an engineer and she was responsible for town planning, she was the one who contributed towards reshaping the city of Johannesburg to have what we call the integrated housing development, so that they can try to eradicate the shanty towns and the informal settlements around the periphery of the city. She did that, but there was quite a lot of resistance because the city didn't see any value for money. Remember, she's coming back to a country that is embedded in capitalist ideals of how to build a city, looking at inferences such as New York, Paris, wanting to change the city of Joburg to become the Paris of this world, but at what expense? So she understood that she went to Russia to learn some of these values that they needed to inscribe in the kind of professional development that they needed to contribute towards state development. So I'm so happy that at least that we get to tie freedom, what freedom meant for those students. Most of those students are now retired. What freedom meant for them. Freedom was not just only about individualistic, attainment of their professions, social accumulation, social upward mobility, but it was the consciousness of making sure that whatever institution they served as professions, that institution is grounded on the values of ensuring that the marginalized communities that they had fought for, they get access, equitable access to those resources. So as I'm about to close, what I would like to leave as a message to this group is that I know there's a lot of geopolitics that are happening around the world. BRICS is reshaping itself. Russia is playing a very significant role in reshaping the global South relations, the global North. are also in a quagmire, not knowing whether they want to be on the far left or the far right. But what we also need to remember is that within these geopolitical contexts, Russia continues to be the people's friend. Hence, we've got the Patrice Lumumba People's Friendship University that was established in 1961, primarily to educate African students and Asian students. I'm glad that there's a student from Nepal who spoke from that perspective because there were some students coming from that region and Vietnam. But in this instant, we now have a new university that had emerged post the perestroika in Russia that is now called the People's Friendship University. People's friendship. Russia continues to be a friend, especially amongst those alliances that are considered to be the marginalized who don't have a voice in geopolitics. Russia continues to be that friend to reshape that historical trajectory that is still relevant within the present tense. We are no longer part of the Cold War, but there is a global shift, a much more unipolar shift, where countries should be given the option of aligning itself with countries who've got the same mandate, the same interest in terms of its development and sovereignty. So let us not forget that our education system in developing countries that is also supplemented by the kind of scholarships we are getting from Russia with a very high quality of education supports the development that we should be leading towards our own trajectory as we are trying to find a much more better future that can ensure that there is a level of equity. Maybe one day there will be equality, but we get to deliver the kind of equity that we need to deliver in society. So thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks to the keynote address speaker, Mr. Medupi Shabangu, for emphasizing this kind of important history that we should not remember as young South Africans and other African students and Asian students out there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nzo. I really enjoyed listening to everything that you said. I think sometimes us as students here in Russia, we take for granted the opportunity that we've been given. And I really hope to come back home and make a difference. From what you've said, we should take the knowledge we get here and we should take it home, acknowledging that Russia continues to be a friend to the people. Thank you so much. I would like to pass the chair to Delia, our moderator. We have a question for you, Dr. Nzo. So Delia, take it.
Yes, please don't forget you may post questions on the comment section, or you may post questions on our group if you're still on the WhatsApp group. All right, so we have a question. It says, we are in a similar position which Russia experienced following the crash of the USSR. What can we learn from the manner in which Russia rebuilt itself and moving to self-reliance and not find itself captured by the unsustainable capitalism based on the hoarding profits and not contribute to both nation building and infrastructure development? I'm going to repeat the question again. We are in a similar position which Russia experienced following the crash of the USSR. What can we learn from the manner in which Russia rebuilt itself and moving to self-reliance and not find itself captured by the unsustainable capitalism based on the hoarding of profits and not contribute to both nation building and infrastructure development? All right. The question is addressed. I hope someone can answer it. Dr. Nzo, I think it was specifically for you based on what you had said. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Delia. Oh my goodness. That is quite a big question. It's a big question because it involves a lot of different aspects when it comes to the history of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, particularly during the period of Gorbachev, when he was put in a very tight corner in terms of understanding that transitioning was happening globally. So in this instance, we understand that the Russian historical trajectory during that time, when we also saw how the Soviet Union was starting to take a little bit of a backtrack in terms of supporting liberation movements, because most of the countries in Africa that they were supporting and in the Far East Asia and also Latin America, they were now moving or transitioning towards embracing the idea of globalization, the idea of transitioning into capitalist states. And there are historical references in terms of what contributed towards that. And I don't want to get too much into such details because I don't want to historicize this conversation. But yes, the perestroika and the glasnost started to happen under Gorbachev regime in the late 1980s, where he warmed up to the West, wanted to open up Russia so that it can become a much more globalized country that is beginning to reform its relationship with Western countries. And as from then onwards, we know that in 1991, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, followed by the collapse of the Soviet Union, started to take place. The reality started to set in. Now, during Yeltsin's time, the former president of Russia, Yeltsin, who took after Gorbachev, he opened up Russia. And if I have to draw parallels to what Russia had gone through post 1991, when Russia opened up to its global partners, particularly from the West, and you put that in conjunction with South Africa, what South Africa is going through at the current moment is not different to what Russia went through. Russia had a lot of mineral resources, particularly gas. It had a lot of industries that were nationalized and run by the Russian state. But now it had opened up for investments from the private sector to privatize some of these resources and also sell these resources back to its global allies. So what I can tell you is that during Yeltsin's stage, there was a grab. There was what we call a resource grab. So American partners started to come in to grab some of these resources. We saw the emergence of Russian elites, especially entrepreneurial elites during that stage. That's why when you listen to some of these political analysis that is being done by various political commentators, you hear them mentioning people such as Abramovich, was one of the most wealthiest Russians who benefited from some of these resource grabs. So there was a political elite that was created. But unfortunately, what happened was that because Russians had already been used to a system that catered for all classes in society, Russia began to have a much more elitist community that did not, unfortunately, take care of your poorer communities. So there was now a class division in society. And at a later stage, Russia could see that they could not, unfortunately, grow their economy within this ambit of a capitalist system that was taking all resources and not redistributing resources the way in which it used to be done during the socialist system. So there was change at a later stage. That's when now the president who is sitting in Russia, who is Putin, came back into the fold. He wanted to create order. He wanted to create order because there was a lot of corruption, resource grabbing, non-distribution of resources back into society, no equitable access, and he wanted to stabilize what I can call the pathological downfalls of corruption that is linked to capitalism. So hence Russia became a country that now turned back into history in order to create sort of like stability, if I should put it in that instance, to create stability and ensure that their society is protected. Now, it immerses itself with geopolitics because Russia has a lot of mineral resources, particularly your gas and oil. So, gas, the distribution of gas, Russia decided that they'll go back to quasi nationalization of gas. That's why Gazprom in Russia, it's a state resource. It's not privately owned. Yes, there are players who provide the state with capacity to run that entity, but it is a state resource. Gas in Russia provides energy throughout the western part of Europe up until you get to the UK. So Russia ensured that that gas will remain in its country under the hands of the state, but at the same time, their distribution of gas within Europe benefits the state. And whatever proceeds that are being generated from a nationalized resource are redistributed to the state. So it's one of those small little typical examples that I can use in the way in which Russia went back into its historical state formation to ensure that they don't lose grip in terms of providing the necessary basic goods and services that are needed by its citizens. Russia strengthened its geopolitical ties with their former allies. Russia has always been a military state. It revived its military prowess. Hence, Russia is one of those countries that has got very, what I could say, prominent nuclear programs that are always causing a little bit of a friction between the West and the Far East. So Russia tightened its political systems. And in this instance, if we have to compare it to South Africa's transition towards a post-democratic state was that there were dreams, affirmations, and ambitions for students to create an equitable society that they had learned from Russia. But unfortunately, South Africa had embedded itself in a capitalist system that didn't understand the values of providing those equitable principles. Hence, in the current state, we find that South Africa is struggling with issues related to corruption. It's struggling with principles of individuality, where entrepreneurs, businessmen, and those who hold the greatest levels of power in the economy of South Africa refuse to redistribute the economic access to those who were marginalized in the past. So in this instance, South Africa still remains a little bit drawn back, but Russia made progress because it went back to its historical formation. That South Africa doesn't have, because South Africa had never become a socialist state under apartheid. It never became a communist state during apartheid. It had always been embedded in capitalism, exploitation of labor, marginalization of the poor. So it is a very big question that it needs a proper analogy, but it is not something that we can say that we cannot reference ourselves to Russia, because Russia did go through the kind of tragedy that South Africa is going through right now in the early 90s, until President Putin came back into the fold to bring back a sense of authority and stability into Russia. South Africa needs stability. South Africa needs a sense of authority in a leader. South Africa needs a leader that will be able to say, as the youth, the younger generation, you are graduating as doctors, neurosurgeons, accountants, scientists, engineers. But do you understand the value that you need to make and contribute towards society besides the individualistic driven ideals of accumulation, just because we are driven by the principles of capitalism that are grounded on wealth and accumulation, self-accumulation. So those are the types of principles that I think South Africa really struggles with. And it's up to the youth to have the political consciousness that an unequal society is sustainable, because South Africa is faced with a threat in the future of having an uprising, a rebellion from the poor. Let me just end it there. Thanks.